Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to have you all here. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and director for the Center, or of the Center, sorry, for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It's once again really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Isabel Molina-Guzmán is a professor of communication and Latino studies with affiliations in gender and women's studies, Latin American and Caribbean studies, and the Institute of Communications Research at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She also currently serves as Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Faculty Director of the Illinois Sloan University Center for Exemplary Mentoring. Cristal Camargo, a doctoral student at Northwestern and a graduate affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Isabel in just a minute. I'm delighted to note that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the Latino Studies program. But before we go into the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly how the seminar will unfold. First, Cristal will tell us more about Isabel's research and career in just a minute. Then Isabel will deliver her seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Cristal will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Cristal, the screen is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Pablo, for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to introduce today's guest speaker. Dr. Isabel Molina-Guzmán is a professor of communication and Latina studies with affiliations in gender, women's studies, Latin American and Caribbean studies, and the Institute for Communication Research at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She currently serves as the Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and a faculty director for the Illinois Sloan University Center for Exemplary Mentoring. Furthermore, Dr. Molina-Guzmán founded the Ethnicity, Race, and Communication Division for the International Communication in 2005 and currently serves as a co-editor for the Journal of Feminist Media Studies. She has received countless internal and external awards for her service, teaching, and commitment to diversity and inclusion. Dr. Molina-Guzmán's research broadly examines the interrelationships between Latinos, Latinas, gender, race, ethnicity, and communication. She is the author of more than 2,000 academic articles and 2 books, including Latinos and Latinos on Television that came out in 2018, and Latina Bodies in the Media that came out in 2010. Her work has also appeared in many places, including the 2016 White House Conference on Women and Girls of Color, the New York Times, and National Public Radio, amongst other outlets. Using 3 case studies that range from entertainment, social media, and news material from her upcoming book, Black/Latinidad, Dr. Molina-Guzmán's seminar provides a relational framework for studying performances of Blackness and Latinidad within contemporary visual culture. She unpacks how media producers, audiences, popular culture fans, and publics make sense of Blackness and Latinidad, including troubling assumptions. Placing this framework within the contemporary context of neoliberal multiculturalism, visual discourses of Blackness and Latinidad, she argues that Black/Latinidad exists in a fraught terrain of authenticity where US social, culture, and economic policies depend on the validation of one minority community and the devaluation of another. Without further ado, Dr. Molina-Guzmán.
Thank you so much. I just want to start by thanking Professor Bukowski, Mora Matas, and Crystal Camargo for that amazing introduction. I was going to do my land acknowledgement reading, but I believe it has already been done superbly. And so I just want to add my acknowledgement that I am working and living on the ancestral lands of several indigenous nations. So I want to begin by going back to the raíces, or the roots of this project. And I'm going to ask for your indulgence as I situate myself in this work through a series of autoethnographic vignettes that I hope will allow you to better understand my relationship to this project. Today, scene 1. It is my turn at the hospital. I make myself as comfortable as I can in the ICU room as I sit with my father through the night. He's experiencing more internal bleeding, so I've called the nurse and I'm trying to keep my father calm by having him tell me about our family's history. I ask him to tell me what he knows about my mother's family. He tells me about the Rosas. He tells me about my maternal great-grandmother, Mama Juana Jorge Rosas, the granddaughter of an enslaved woman known only to the family now as Mama Goya. Conducting research for my master's thesis on discourses of racial identity, scene 2, I interview a woman named Teresa. In a response to a question about how others perceive her identity on the island, Teresa, who identifies as white and Puerto Riqueña, quietly, as if sharing a secret, tells me that she is perceived as white. With a hint of embarrassment, she tells me, people on the island always joke about their whiteness. You say you're white in Puerto Rico, and others joke, ¿y tu abuela, dónde está? The refrain is meant to subtly and humorously challenge one's Boricua claim to racial purity, one's claim to whiteness. ¿Y tu abuela, en dónde está? And your grandmother, where is she? One can only know for sure who you are descended from, after all, on the maternal side. Teresa is slightly embarrassed and uncomfortable in her telling. Decades later, I understand her racial vulnerability, the impossibleness of proving a negative assertion despite her claims to whiteness, and her recognition that because of my Blackness, though I'm never read as Black on the island, the joke would never be made to me. Scene 3. A young child newly arrived in the United States. I am often asked the question, what are you? Puerto Riqueña, I answer, no, but what are you? Are you Black? Are you white? Are you mixed? As an 8-year-old attending elementary school in the US for the first time, it takes me longer to figure out that question and the answer to it than it does to learn English. Final scene. Returning to my roots, I believe the Mama Goya spirit called for my birth. As the first grandchild born to both sides of the family, I was born on March 22nd, the day of the 1873 emancipation of the slaves in Puerto Rico. Mama Goya is my call and my response. Mama Goya is my call. This project is my response to answer the question I will never be asked, ¿Y tu abuela en dónde está? This project is my complicated response to the answer question, what are you? In today's talk, I provide a framework for studying performances of Blackness in relation to Latinidad, and Latinidad in relation to Blackness. Specifically, I'm going to focus on two case studies and engage in a final reflection on a third to illustrate the following ideas for studying race, ethnicity, and gender in contemporary visual media culture. First, I look at the controversy over the casting of Zoe Saldana to play the role of Black icon Nina Simone in order to think through the cultural and social implications and limitations of performances of Blackness as embodied by Latinas in mainstream Hollywood movies, the contemporary politics of authenticity, and the role of movies in the visual technology of race. I build on the work of performance scholars such as E. Patrick Johnson on Black authenticity. I play with his question on how are the stakes changed when a white body performs Blackness to ask what is at stake when a Latina performs Blackness in the contemporary context of anti-Black racism, Latino demographic emergence, and Black demographic decline. In the second case study, I look at the hashtag Blaxican on Instagram to think through the visual practice of photography to explore the possibilities of taking up bell hooks calls for, quote, Black critical thinkers to break with hegemonic modes of seeing, thinking, and being that block our capacity to see ourselves oppositionally, to imagine, describe, and invent ourselves in ways that are liberatory. In particular, I discuss how self-representations by mixed race and multicultural U.S. Black and Latino X living in Los Angeles work within the visual technology of race to produce a digital race assemblage that exposes the limitations of the visual as truth. And finally, I conclude with a reflection on Latino X death. I reach out to the concept of visual failure in terms of the reporting or lack of reporting on police killings of predominantly Black urban Latino youth in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and working class Latino indigenous deaths during the pandemic. Rather than studying race as visual technology dependent on its visibility as evidence of its truth, I reflect on what is at stake when visual difference is deemed ineligible, when modern Black, Latino, and indigenous genocides collide. I begin my first case study. A slash, not a hyphen. These three case studies are about hyphenated identities presumably living in a comfortable relationship, are not about hyphenated identities, which are presumed to live in a comfortable relationship. They are instead about subject positions living in tension with one another, an identity strategically managing the others, an identity erased by external others. Invoking the term Black/Latino highlights what Miriam Jimenez Roman and Juan Flores described as, quote, the inadequacy of the Latinx concept, along with the need to broaden and complicate the notion of Blackness in the United States, end quote, and the need to complicate the assumptions that Latinidad and Blackness are mutually exclusive. Blackness in this context is defined as the material conditions in which Black people are structured, as well as the cultural practices, social medias, and cultural identifications by which Black people negotiate and construct meaningful lives. Similarly, Latinidad signals the material conditions and Latinos and the semiotic process of being, performing, and commodifying and structuring US Latino identity and lives. The slash for me is evocative of moments and visual and social disidentification, of painful and pleasurable cognitive dissonance, a la Jose Esteban Munoz, where the ways one is being hailed by others to identify does not always cohere with their self-reflection or performances of self. A moment of disidentification turned into intellectual frustration and oppositional consciousness, as defined by Chela Sandoval, to read discourses about Afro-descendant Latinas and mixed-race, multi-ethnic Black and Latino communities as disrupting and reinforcing familiar optics of race and decentering a common sense definition of visually embodied and strategically commodified Blackness and Latinidad. I do so by bringing together three kinds of theoretical fields. One is, of course, Black and women of color feminism, to think through issues of intersectionality, power, and privilege. The second is the robust field of Latina media visual studies, which has been so wonderfully represented in the seminar in the work of Angela Valdivia, Jillian Baez, Maria Elena Cepeda, Mari Beltran, Mari Castañeda, younger scholars like Diana Leon Boyce and Araceli Gutierrez, that really thinks through the innovative methodological approaches that are grounded in intersectional and relational understandings of Latinidad within the mainstream and always grounded in the political, economic, and social context. And finally, I employ minoritized performance studies to think through the role of performance and debates about the performative and the way that, again, it tells us something about the political, economic, and social tensions within which we exist. For me, these visual artifacts that I explore are produced and performed by social actors, whether it be through legacy media such as film or television, digital media such as blogs, or social media like Instagram. All of these visual artifacts communicate and are informed by pre-existing intersectional hierarchies of power and difference, hierarchies that privilege some categories of identity while relationally marginalizing others. Mediated discourses and visual performances of difference ultimately tell us something about how we imagine others different from us and see ourselves as part of an imagined community. So I'm going to begin with case study 1, Saldana as Simone. On September 12th, 2012, the New York Times featured a story with the following question: should Zoe Saldana play Nina Simone? Some say no. At the heart of the report was a national debate, an online choice.org petition protesting the casting of US-born Saldana, who self-identifies as both Black and Latina, as the iconic African-American singer, composer, and civil rights activist Nina Simone. The casting of Saldana as Simone reveals a complicated and serious set of issues. Among them, the structurally racist typecasting practices that limit roles for dark-skinned African Americans and Latinas, and the complicated demands by audiences for racial and ethnic authenticity in casting that depends on the power-laden employment of race as a visual technology. Recently, calls for authenticity have shifted to the sonic, with debates over dubbing and voiceover work, such as around the dubbing of the award-winning movie Soul. And so I think that adds another layer to really think through the sort of relationship between the visual and the sonic and issues of power and the technology of race. In this case study, like all the others, I'm not questioning nor arguing against demands by Black and Latino activists for authentic representations in front of and behind the camera, a demand that has gained urgency under the confrontation with systemic racism of the last year. And of course, as a media studies scholar, I agree that the representational matters. Yet, as minoritized performance studies scholar Johnson, Jose Munoz, and Sandra Ruiz call for, I use the discourses surrounding the debate over authenticity and Black Latina performance as a key to understanding the social, political, and cultural implications embedded in the casting debate. So in particular, I want to explore how Saldana's response and the discourse by Black women audiences to her casting, what these tell us about the social, political, and cultural implications of Black/Latina performances of Blackness. So what do I mean by race as a visual technology? Building on the work of Jennifer Gonzalez, who illustrates that discourses about photography and discourses about race are intimately intertwined through a shared dependence on their truth effect. First, she argues that photography and race discourses obscure the ideological systems that produce their salience by positioning visuality itself as a material evidence of their existence. It is real then because it is an image taken by a camera that produces an exact and therefore real replication of the photographed object. I am Black because I visually look Black, and the visual is by definition truthful. Photography is essential to the production of race as a social construction in the West. Photography and other visual media reproduce a hierarchical system of visual codes around constructions of race. Though these codes may shift slightly over time and space, they always remain constrained by the imperatives of empire and racial capitalism that insist on and depend on the visual othering and devaluation of difference. Thus, race and the visual are intimately connected. Race for Gonzalez is a visual system of power that has been the empirical subject of every technological innovation in visual recording devices, from the lithograph to Instagram to film to DNA sequencing. The visual truth effects of race are empirically measurable. They have empirically measurable consequences embedded in white patriarchal heteronormative structures of empire and racial capital. My project extends Gonzalez's observations from photography, of course, to the visual and digital performance of Black/Latinidad to unpack the concept of race as a visual technology of power, to understand the contradictory ways that we as media producers and audiences, popular culture fans and publics, make sense of the visual and visual performances of Black Latinidad. It is within this complicated media context that I focus on the Saldana Simons controversy to critique race as visual technology. To do so, I analyze news and industry coverage, the online petition against her casting, blogs, and other social media texts surrounding the debate. And I situate the cultural negotiations within Blackness and Black audience with Latinidad in the United States as contested sites of meaning over both Blackness and Latinidad. It is Saldana's complex desire, willingness, and ability to occupy and claim a Latina ethnic and a US Black racial identity that reveals the incomplete edges of authenticity and the flow of racial capital in visual technology. Saldana, in a May 2006 interview with Latina magazine that featured her on the cover, said she felt slighted by lighter-skinned Dominicans who, quote, thought their blue eyes and fair skin were more attractive than many Dominicans' dark skin and eyes. Growing up among Dominicans who valorize blue eyes and light color skin, Saldana seems to recognize that to perform Blackness and Latinidad together is a radical identity. Yet the unrecognized tension embedded in Saldana's claim to Blackness is informed by the ongoing conflicts of US Latinos' relationship to Blackness and Black communities. As Kateri Hernandez argues, quote, current discussions about the demographic explosion of Latinas and Latinos and their desire to assume greater political clout has focused upon the presumed obstructionism and discontent of Anglo Blacks, who must relinquish their power to accommodate Latinas and Latinos. However, few commentators detail the manner in which the Latino community's own racism interferes with its ability to productively build bridges with the Anglo and Black community. End quote. The political, cultural, and economic stakes embedded in the relationship of racial valuation for some and devaluation for others, as Lisa Cacho proposes in her work on social death, between Black and Latino communities, underlie contestations over the cinematic performance of Black authenticity and the visual technology of race within the structures of racial capitalism. In using the term racial capitalism, I'm invoking Cedric Robinson's concept that defined it as the interdependence between capitalism and racial inequality and violence to produce economic value. At stake in Black activist discourses opposed to the casting of Saldana is the visual performance of US Blackness grounded in the racial history of slavery, of the fight for US birthrights, full citizenship, of colorism, of the physical embodiment of race through a Black/Latino body. As Lisa Simone Kelly, Nina Simone's daughter, said in an interview with the New York Times over the conflict, quote, "My mother was raised at a time when she was told her nose was too wide, her skin was too dark. Appearance-wise, this is not the best choice." Underlying her criticism and the criticism of others against the casting of Saldana is the assumption that authentic Black identity in the United States is determined by a non-ethnic US birth and skin color of appropriate darkness. In other words, Black authentic identity depends on being born in the US under the systemically racist structures of the US. And it's over-determined by skin color, and particularly skin color of appropriate darkness. In response to a French poster to her blog, coffeerhetoric.com, Tiff Jones, the creator of Tiff Jones responded, "I have a multicolor family, and these subjects is very uncomfortable for me. Don't forget that at the end," sorry, that was a response. That was what the commenter from France responded to. And Tiffany Joe's response was, "While I understand your perspective, perhaps the mechanics of race relations and colorism work a little differently where you're from than it does here in the US." And the poster was commenting, identified as commenting from France. Responses such as this one by Tiff Jones reinforces authentic definitions of US Blackness, grounded in the visual and in the violent history of race and systemic racism in the United States. Both the images of which you see on the side and the comments in the blogs and petitions work to highlight physical difference between the women, in particular skin color, hair texture, body size, and nose. And for cultural activists such as Naima Valer, who was the creator of the Choice.org petition against the casting of Saldana, the issue of skin color is not so much color accuracy as color visibility, and the historical erasure of African-American women with dark skin color, larger bodies, women who exist outside the Western normative standards of beauty as visualized in the mainstream media, oftentimes in the Black media, and certainly within Spanish language Latino media. In a special interview on Blog Talk Radio, Valer said that for her, the issue of color was not so much about racial authenticity, but about the relationship between the whitening of African-American women actors and the self-esteem of dark-skinned African-American women. Thus, it is about Nina's skin color as key to the authentic performance of Nina Simone. Nina Simone is her skin color. The visual performance of skin color is Nina Simone. The intersection of race, heteronormativity, and gender are once again the site of imagination building and national contestation. Yet Valer and Jones and others select images that highlight the singer's dark skin, physical elegance, and privilege, and Afrocentric beauty aesthetic to emphasize their point regarding respectability, which was not always how Nina Simone presented herself. In the very beginning image of the ABC story, you see kind of a different performance of identity by Nina Simone. The focus on dark skin visuality is not so much about Saldana as it is about the whitening of Black bodies in Hollywood. Simone herself, who during the 1960s and 1970s participated in radical Black nationalist activism, privileged Black power, Blackness, and Black bodily aesthetics as are called out by these cultural activists, which enabled her, or basically has encouraged audiences to see her as an icon of dark-skinned African-American beauty. The use of these images, rather than images emphasizing Simone's celebration, the use of these images emphasize Simone's celebration of Afrocentric aesthetics, rather than attempts to use white hair aesthetics such as those used by ABCnews.com that illustrate Simone with straightened and bobbed hair. Scholars of Nina Simone herself recognize that the singer and composer only sometimes and selectively wore her hair in traditional or natural African and African American style. Thus, the foregrounding of skin color and the location of the authentic Black experience within the United States become problematic for some audiences and cultural activists by highlighting the truth effects of the visual performance of race for others. For some of the blog postings, Simone's more complicated racial and gender politics and her engagement with global calls for racial equality are linked to a more fluid or subtle performance of Blackness / Latinidad. Feminist historian Ruth Feldstein reminds us that here too, when Nina Simone located American race relations in an international context in ways that drew attention to gender as well as race, Simone was part of a larger cohort of Black women who evoked international as well as American issues in discussions of race. Although Saldana is of darker skin color and a US citizen by birth who grew up in the midst of the New York's hostile racial climate, her ethnic identity as a Latina implicitly categorizes her as not Black. Because embodied representations of identity become the primary site through which authentic representations of US Blackness are performed, the commodification of Simone's life through a Black / Latino body reveal embedded conflicts over cultural, political, and economic resources. Ironically, by focusing on the visual performance of Blackness connected to place, the continental US, these discourses of Black authenticity contribute to the performance of race as a visual technology that reinforces the visual truth effects of race, embedded in the legacy of heteronormative structures of empire and racial capital. What is at stake in this debate then over authentic performances of Black / Latinidad is the existing and increasing tensions between African American and Latino activists and communities, which we have most recently seen played out in the presidential election, as some Latino voters responded negatively to the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as to responded to the call for stricter immigration reform and anti-Latino sentiment. Susan Obler and Eduardo Bonilla Silva and others document that once close allies during the 1960s and 1970s, struggles for better housing, education, and employment in African American and Latino communities during the past few decades have moved Latinas and Latinos away from Blackness towards brownness and the implicit privileging of whiteness. Lisa Cacho's work demonstrates the way the media discourses about these conflicts over immigration and employment depend on the social devaluation of one ethnic and racial group over over other ethnic and racial groups, over the valuation of other ethnic and racial groups, further fueling tensions within already marginalized communities. And again, we saw this at play out in the election, where the Trump campaign was able to make ground with some African American as well as Latino voters on the grounds of economics, employment, and immigration. Ultimately, the performance of Black and Latino identity functioned within the visual to reinforce and restructure race as visual technology. Second case study. Through an analysis of the cultural performance of and by Afro-Latino and Black Latino identity in blogs, online commentary, museums, and cultural exhibits, I take up Bell Hook's proposition to imagine, describe, and invent ourselves in ways that are liberatory. For the remainder of this talk, I'm going to do that by thinking through the Instagram hashtag Blaxican and Blaxicans of LA. The hashtag was initiated by Walter Thompson Hernandez in a desire to give visibility to the Los Angeles experiences of US Black and Mexican descendant communities he described as having duality of identities and experiences as they negotiate both their ethnic and racial identities in relation to each other and white racism. According to Pew, about 12% of Latinos identify as mixed race or multiracial, as Black, with another identity, that's 4%, and is more than two races, 22%. So 22% of Latinos and 34% of Latinos from the Caribbean identify as Afro-Latino or Afro-Caribbean or multiple races. Los Angeles itself is a minority majority city with 47.5% identifying as Latinos, 10% Asian, and 9% Black non-ethnic, with whites making up 29.4% of the population. In an interview about his project, which I'll talk about in a minute in more detail, he argues that the way I see it, Blaxicans really challenge the way we think about race and force us to think about racial identities in more inclusive and broad ways. Blaxicans are dual minorities. We represent two of the largest ethnic minority groups. And I think because Blaxicans represent two of the most aggrieved groups in Los Angeles, it's important to understand that certain sets of issues and challenges that have been traditionally labeled as African American or Latino ultimately do not exist for people who self-identify as Blaxican. For Thompson Hernandez, the way to challenge the way we think about race is through the visual and the autoethnographic. It is through questioning the visual technology of race. Thompson Hernandez. So the Blaxicans of LA and the Instagram project was created in May 2015. It has more than 9,000 followers. Blaxicans of LA, that particular tag has 167 plus posts. His exhibit that occurred at the Annenberg space, featured the Instagram, sort of selections from the Instagram photography. The Instagram photos was featured and reported on in CNN, the LA Times, and Latinas. So I want to think about how the digital race scholars have laid a foundation for conceptualizing the internet as both racially segregated and racializing space that marks and performs racial identity and racial difference in regressive and progressive ways. In other words, scholarship on race and the internet often assumes a direct association between identity and representation, or an albeit troubled but symbiotic relationship between the visualization of racial categories in the real world and racial performances of identity online. For Sanya Sharma, online analysis must move beyond the logics of identity and visual performance, which can limit race to either being a signifier to be semiotically deconstructed or an embodied difference to be overcome. Alternatively, Sharma advances the concept of studying online performances of race as an assemblage that traces its emergence in the online network relations. The potentiality of race to become otherwise in digital networks, such as in the case of Black tags or the hashtag Blaxican, is neither positive nor negative. Rather, the possibility that race can do different things opens towards new understandings of how it functions as a visual technology. It is worth stressing that a materialist approach to analyzing race and digital networks resist the significance of meaning and representation or erasing the subject. Instead, for Sharma, he argues that it provides a point of departure, a point that discovers and interrogates digital race assemblage by offering an alternative methodology, which attends to the materiality of the digital object itself. And for Thompson Hernandez, his project involves the phenomenological visualization of how we come to embody ethnicity and race as intersectional identities so that we can critique the power bound in the visual technology of race, how we come to understand Black/Mexican, Black/Latino. Now, of less explicit interest to Thompson Hernandez, I want to recognize is the intersectionality of the ways that race and ethnicity work with gender and sexuality and are brought into visual ways of seeing ethnic and racial difference. That is, the very gendered differences in performances of Black/Mexican or Black/Latino. And so there are key differences for me in terms of the way that Blaxican gender and sexual identities are depicted, policed, and portrayed within the Blaxican project, and that holds different cultural consequences for various groups. The images of the portrait project, Blaxican, seek to interrupt notions of ethnic and racial authenticity that flatten out or homogenize difference. In doing so, it gives visibility to the ways in which ethnic, racial, and gender differences exist in discomfort with one another and in collaboration with one another. In the words of Ari, and so it allows us to think through sort of the distortions that happen when those sort of multiple identities collide. Through the visual and attempted, so in doing so, I argue this project gives visibility to the ways in which differences are produced and lived, or in the words of Audre Lorde, quote, to recognize those differences and to examine the distortions which result from our misnaming them and their effects on human behavior and expectations. Through the visual, an attempt to contest the racial system of power is deployed to come out as Black/Mexican, to insist on being seen as Black and Mexican is a recognition of the powerful act of the visual technology of race and the way that digital technologies and social media can disrupt or create different forms of power within that technology. Always, of course, constrained by the fact that it flows and functions within a media culture that is ultimately embedded in the project of racial capitalism. So we need to think about the sort of digital boundaries or the ways in which those limits come to be, right? The ways that those visual depictions of Black/Mexican or Black/Latino are informed in ways that reinforce heteronormativity and that reinforce gendered and classed, acceptable gendered and class performances of gender and sexual identity. So I want to conclude. I know my time is running out and I want to leave questions, time for questions. I want to conclude with reflections of the last chapter that I'm currently working and thinking through. Ironically, it goes back to my initial interest in this project, which happened as a result of the death of Trayvon Martin by a white Latino in Florida. I want to think about the visual and digital tech, of how visual and digital technology exist in a racially segregated and racializing space, and think through what are the limits of that space. Jody Malamed defines neo-racial multiculturalist discourse as a new language for making sense of racial and ethnic difference that maintains pre-existing barriers to inequality while creating the semblance of ethnic and racial progress by enabling the cultural visibility of emerging categories of ethnic and racial identities, perhaps Black/Latina or Black/Mexican. Malamed argues ethnicity and race are central to contemporary neoliberal logics through what she terms neoliberal multiculturalism, or the hegemony of neoliberal multiculturalism, which she defines as hegemony that manages racial contradictions on a national and international scale for US-led neoliberalism. It appropriates and abstracts ethnic and racial difference, suturing anti-racist discourse to neoliberal policy and global capitalism. Thompson Hernandez's portrait project speaks to how performances of ethnicity, race, and gender, grounded in bodily and physical markers of race and ethnicity, even as those performances seek to destabilize dominant categories of identity, remain embedded in and productive of discourses that manage these racial contradictions in the service of neoliberal multiculturalism and racial capitalism. The hashtag Blaxican project engages in what intersectional digital race studies scholar Lisa Nakamura terms the production of digital visual capital, as a commodity that produces desirable embodied subject positions of individual users organized and networked together in online relationships to constitute racialized spaces and performances of identity. Digital media platforms allow us the study of how contemporary network relationships stabilize and destabilize established categories of Blackness as a lived identity, consequently enabling the possibility of emergent formations of Blackness to arise. But if race as a visual technology that engages the visuals for its truth effects, then the Blaxican project equally depends on the visual and all the limitations of the visuals to produce its alternative truth. The visualization takes attention away from the structural disenfranchisement of African Americans, Black/Latinos in the United States, and African and Afro-Latinos in the Americas, thereby disempowering political, social, and cultural calls for equity that decenter hegemonic power, even as it wants to use the visual to foreground structural disenfranchisement. Visual representations and performances about and by those who identify as diasporic Black in the United States, Afro-Latino, or mixed race multi-ethnic Black/Latina live in the comfort and discomfort of the slash, challenge their absence from Latinidad by insistence on being racially seen, and exclusions within Blackness by insisting on having ethnicity visually recognized. The case studies that I looked at provide a unique opportunity to disrupt the power of race as visual technology, as a common sense yet unstable visual way of performing ethnicity and race in the United States. So I want to think about where Latinidad is, where the visual performance of Black/Latinidad exists in the ever circulating video depictions of racial terror. What are the implications of Latino and Indigenous invisibility in the context of the hypervisibility of Black death? Depicted and archived photographs of lynchings were community affairs, publicly condoned, documented, a vital part of the visual technology of race. These photos memorialize moments of white bloodlust, of pleasure, of reinforcing familial bonds, of producing white racial identity and privilege. The photos were sold to newspapers and spectators who desired to memorialize their participation in the killing of Black and Brown people. They didn't come close to circulating as widely as videos and photographs do today, but they contributed to producing fear from those who were the subject of violence. Today's images of police killings are viewed, reviewed, and edited in a never-ending and network loop, weaving together traditional internet and social media news. This digital archive of Black death culturally works in similar ways to the popular drawings and photos of lynchings before them. Every new video of Black people killed by police creates a new wave of grief, reminding our communities of the systemic power relations that continue to subjugate us. Less visible within this discourse is the systematically racist health and policing institutions that contribute to the killing of those who are visualized outside of Blackness. Indigenous people, Mexicans and Mexican American citizens in the West and the Southwest experienced a similar fate surrounding lynching. In Texas alone, hundreds of Mexican Americans were lynched, beheaded, and burned alive. The practice of lynching contributed to a culture of racial terror in the South, the form of terrorism used to enforce racial subordination and segregation. Today, like Black Americans, Latinos are disproportionately murdered by police, but are often left out of the movement against police brutality. A Washington Post investigation found that between 2015 and 2020, Latinos died at a rate of 23 per million residents after encounters with police, second only to Black people at 31 per million residents. In a contest no group wants to win, quote unquote, the Washington Post. The Times found that 67% of people fatally shot by Los Angeles police officers since 2018 were Latino, even though they make up about 49% of the city's population. And a 2018 report by Washington University in St. Louis found that Latino men were more at risk than any other demographic of being killed by police in gentrifying neighborhoods or neighborhoods with little diversity. I I recognize the power of the visual technology, the popular belief that what we see with our eyes must be the truth, as proposed by the prosecutor in his closing argument of the Chauvin trial. But what we see is also shaped by our culture, upbringing, and the media. It is a filtered and malleable truth. In making a comparison between lynching photos and videos of killings by police and the hyper-visibility of Black death and the hyper-invisibility of brown death, I'm not suggesting that the acts are equivalent. What I am suggesting is that beginning in 2015, when Donald Trump announced his candidacy, conservative political discourses have focused on the vilification of racial and ethnic others. A study of the effects of Trump's rhetoric found that US citizens who identified as politically conservative and racially white were more likely to blatantly dehumanize ethnic, racial, and religious minorities. The study found that once people dehumanize the other, it makes it more likely for them to support racially supremacist actions and policies against those they see as less human. It is perhaps the most troubling truth, the free and unregulated circulation of videos and the invisibility of other murders of police killings of Black, brown, and indigenous people under the label of factual, journalistic, and graphic content contributes to the dehumanization of our communities. It is perhaps the most troubling truth effect of the visual technology of race. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Molina-Guzmán, for such a thought-provoking presentation. Not only is this seminar timely, as you pointed out, that 1/4 of the Latinx population self-identifies as Black Latinx, but it also adds to the growing scholarship of race as a visual technology. And also, like, based on my knowledge of both Black and Latinx media studies, a lot of that scholarship, which makes total sense, often focuses on whiteness, that we often don't see a whole lot of scholarship. I know you do this with some of your other books, as well as your articles where you talk about Black Latinidad, but I think your work in general is like starting to fill a gap that is very much needed in terms of understanding this. This kind of reminds me of, there's a quote by Jose Esteban Munoz, where he talks about how Latinidad is not whiteness, it's not Blackness, it's somewhere in the middle. And I'm like, where, what does that mean? What is the middle? And I think you're getting us closer to understanding that complexity, specifically of Black Latinidad. And I have so many different questions, but I know we are almost at time and I want to leave some time for the audience. But I really do like this notion of looking at race as visual technology and understanding this relational relationship between both Blacks, between the construction of Blackness and Latinidad, and when those intersect. I liked how you talked a little bit about Zoe Saldana and how her policing of Blackness within kind of like the biopic film. You also talked about the social media hashtag Blaxican, which I definitely love, as well as then you mentioned Adam Toledo news material. I was wondering if there are any other forms of like media that you are like considering, because you talk about both the limitations and the possibilities of each sectors. And I just wanted to know if you're considering like other forms of a visual representation in your analysis.
Yeah, so I'm looking at I'm looking at, sort of entertainment media, right? Film and television, social media, and news. Those are definitely the primary three. But I think, one of the elements of, I have to do a deeper archival research in this. I'm really interested in also looking at the aesthetic and visual art, and artists, right, like Coco Fusco and others, in sort of thinking through the ways that I think they, they're able to use that visual technology of race to question, to really have us, like, to confront us with that disjuncture between Black/Latino, or Latino or Latinx. And so that's an area that I would love to be able to dig my fingers into. Finally, I think the final, or the last area is not about the visual per se, but about how audiences or everyday people make sense of the visual in their lives, right? And so that's the final part of the project, is actually talking to people who identify as either Afro, Latino, Latinx, or Black and Latino, like mixed race, multi-ethnic, to actually talk, to actually hear their voices about how their relationship to the visual and their own sort of negotiations and performances of self, which takes me back to that initial project I mentioned in my introduction. I kind of want to go back to that work. So I love talking to people. So I'm going back to doing that method, which I really enjoy.
That sounds super exciting. I can't wait to kind of learn more about how you're using race as a visual technology. I wanted to give the audience the opportunity to either write a comment on the Q&A or to unmute themselves. I know some of you might have that option. If not, I definitely have more questions and will selfishly use this time to ask them. This also reminded me of a Hollywood Reporter roundtable that was released in the fall that featured a lot of Black Latinos. I think on it was like Gina Torres, Lazo Alonso, Dasha Polanco, Mara La Negra. There's one person that I can't remember, but they're talking about their erasure in Hollywood, specifically their Afro-Latinidad erasure. And I remember they started off this wonderful roundtable talking about how they're often like, wait, you're Black, but you speak Spanish, so what is it? Which one are you? Which goes back to what you're talking about, how Blackness and Latinidad are constructed. I know you're talking about visual technology, and I think selfishly as someone that studies sound, I wanted to know like some of the technology or examples that you're using has sound. Is there a way in those examples that like either Blackness or Latinidad, or specifically Spanish, is being used to like connotate Latinidad?
Yeah, I think sound is such an important part. I mean, it's so connected, I think, to the performance of race, right? They go together. And I think, in the past I've talked about how it itself is racializing for Latinos in different ways. I think the implications, I think the racialization of sound within Blackness and then the racialization of sound within Latinidad function a little bit differently, but both to contribute to sort of the marginalization and further racialization of those groups as not being part of the normative. And in some ways, it's interesting because sound and accents are the one sort of aspect of authenticity that then in some ways gets the most called out, right? Like performing Black speech or performing an accented Spanish when you're not, when you're white and not Latino, are often, some of the most problematic elements of discourse of authenticity that get called out. So I think there's definitely an interesting interconnection there between the visual and the sonic.
Isabel and Crystal, can I jump in with a question that builds on Crystal's and what you just said? I was wondering if you could comment on sound and sort of the geographic/regional aspects in the States. There are different combinations of Black and Latina in different parts of the States through histories of migration, internal and also, immigration. And thinking about how you ended your talk on sort of project on audiences, where do you think these tensions on the audience side are negotiated differently in, say, LA versus New York, in the Southwest versus the South, right? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, that's a really great observation because sounds like, anything else, sound like race or performances of ethnicity is grounded in space and location, right? And a Nuyorican accent is a particular, is interesting because I was just in Florida and I could hear Nuyorican accents in Florida, and so it made me think a lot about this, right? Like how does that accent focus in a work in a racializing way outside of its geographical context? And I spent a lot of time in Texas where the accent or accented Spanish is is very differently, is different and read differently. And so I'm slightly less familiar with LA, but I mean, to your point, I think it's important thinking about the relationship between the embodiment of race and ethnicity and sound to unpack those and not homogenize them, because they are very particular to the spaces and connected to class. So space and class, and like you said, histories of migration, right? And so I think it's I think that that's a really rich sort of area to think through. How is, and I didn't talk about the sonic at, but I know it is increasingly becoming a key area of that we need to really think about and tackle. So, and I know that there are some sonic studies scholars in the audience, and so I'm eager to like hear their work and response and thoughts on this.
Thank you, Isabel. Crystal, do you want to close with one final question?
I'm going to ask our very first one here that says, I'm seeing a bit of pitting celebrities such as Amara La Negra as inauthentic and profiting off of the sale of blackness, which I think goes back to what you're saying in terms of there being a specific type of authentic blackness that's tied to U.S. birthright. Do you have any advice for guiding such discussions in the classroom? Which is an amazing question, by the way.
It is, and yeah. So when I talk about authenticity, you can't really, and I didn't in this talk because it wasn't what I was focused on, but I find it really useful to talk about authenticity and cultural appropriation together, especially in the classroom. Students are very familiar with what cultural appropriation is, and what it looks like. And so it enables then, it creates an opportunity to talk about power embedded in that, and when cultural, and so the ways in which cultural appropriation takes advantage of, or not takes advantage, but appropriates a culture on the margin for the benefit of racial capitalism, or for the benefits of neoliberal multiculturalism. And so I'm thinking of a recent example now. I just saw lots of these high-end designers are using very traditional Mexican embroidery patterns and shirts, and and selling them for outrageous amounts of money, and there's some discussion of a lawsuit against them on the grounds of cultural appropriation. And and so using debates like that really enables students to see the power differential there, right? The power differential of these like multinational, wealthy, sort of, designer clothing that's accessible to only a few people in the globe, often, against, by incorporating the labor grounded in a folkloric or ethnic practice, for working class communities in Mexico. And so I think that, sort of tackling cultural appropriation then leads to questions about authenticity and what is authentic, because then you have to undo that. Okay, so you clearly understand the power differential between this, high designer and sort of communities on the ground in Mexico. But then you have to think about, okay, the instability of, or not the instability, but as Angara Valdivia has talked about, the hybridity of the way cultural practices happen within Latin American and Latino communities, right? That then forces you to ask questions of like, well, where does authenticity begin then, right? So if you unpack the folkloric practice and you see that it actually comes from the bridging together of these different cultural practices within that space, then where does the authenticity rest in that practice? And then where does authenticity rest in that practice? And I think, there's no easy answer to it, but the discomfort with that conversation of trying to trace the root of, well, like, where is the authentic in the authentic, gets students to see how fraught it can be to make claims about one group being authentic and being able to engage in certain practices and other groups not being able to do that. So that would be my advice. That's how I always tackle it, is by talking about cultural appropriation first, and then using that to discuss power, and then using that to discuss authenticity and the sort of difficulties of finding the authentic. And I'd be happy if you email me to send, I can send you some of the exercises I use. I'd be happy to share those with you.
Ooh, that would be amazing. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There are some amazing questions in the chat box. I promise I will find you all's, I'll find everyone's email and make sure I get you their questions. So if you want to answer them that way.
Of course.
But thank you so much for such an amazing seminar and Q&A. I wish it was longer. I feel like an hour never feels long enough, but I know that you are going to transition in the next couple of minutes for the podcast. I want to be respectful, but thank you so much for your time and such an amazing presentation.
Oh, thank you. It was a privilege.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you, Crystal. It was a spectacular seminar, truly. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for joining us. And I invite you to join us next week when Diana Leon Boyce will close the entire year of the seminar series of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Have a great day.